Thank you very much, Chair. And like you just said, it's a more practical to bring the issue of One Health close to home with a disease that we've been dealing with as a country, but also as a continent for a number of years. So Rift Valley fever is the disease I'll be talking about, and I think one thing that just a bracket to mention the fact that sometimes we don't celebrate some of our success. We heard from Prof. Makota the process that went into selecting the 26th member of the OLEP group globally out of 700 people. We are two South Africans in that community, in that group. I mean, out of the 26. So I think it's something that's really yeah. Thank you. So Rift Valley is one of the diseases also that even at OLEP we're looking into as a model example to see how the concept of One Health could be applied. This is, again, a zoonotic disease that affects both human and livestock. It causes a lot of abortions and mortality in animals, while in human it's a flu-like disease, but it's extremely debilitating and can really affect badly a whole community. And the trouble with the disease is that it doesn't happen all the time. It comes like every 10 years, which makes its control quite challenging. It's a viral disease. It's a virus that has three segments. I see there are some students who are doing some virology, maybe for your interest. I could show that those are the three RNA segments of the virus, and what is important is that each segment encodes for specific proteins. You can see I've put them in different color that correspond to the segment. And this is quite important for people who are doing like diagnostic or vaccine research. So, for example, this protein is very immunogenic for diagnostic development, whereas the glycoproteins are very good antigen for vaccine development. So you can either clone the gene and express it into a different system and you'll get a good vaccine, or express the protein. So just for interest. So it's an RNA virus that we heard yesterday. I think somebody was saying how RNA viruses are the one that have been some of the biggest problem on a regular basis for outbreaks. It's quite widespread in Africa. As you can see, it's mainly an African problem, but though it has also occurred in the Middle East. And the name Rift Valley fever corresponds to a physical structure that is called the Rift Valley that goes from Madagascar all the way to Saudi Arabia. It's in this region. And strangely enough, that's where the disease started being discovered, and hence even the extension to Saudi Arabia, it's within the Rift Valley region. Whether the virus come under the ground or what, nobody seems to know really, but it's prominent in the Rift region. And like I said, it's one thing that complicates Rift Valley fever is that it disappears for a number of years, and every 10 years you see it reoccurring. In Kenya, they did also a similar study where they looked into data from 1951, and they could clearly show that it reoccurred in a period of up to 7 years. And so that's what we call inter-epidemic period, where the disease is dormant and then suddenly it reappears. Same studies have been done in South Africa also, where we found also that we've been having reoccurring outbreaks. The big last one was in 2011, 2010, 2011. It was quite massive. We lost, I think, even some vet students who unfortunately got the disease by going to farms to deal with the disease. So it occurs in 2 cycles. So during those inter-epidemic period, you don't have anything. We call it the endemic cycle. In South Africa, we're endemic. There are certain areas where the virus is always circulating, and in an endemic way. And you will have an amplification due to factors like weather, then the mosquito explode in population, and then those mosquitoes, they keep on carrying the virus, and then it will cause an epidemic where you'll have a lot of mortality in animals and also human cases. So the amplification is extremely important to monitor, to break, if you want to break this cycle or to be able to prevent the occurrence of the epidemic, you need to work on being prepared for the amplification. So a large number of animals are susceptible. You can see that the humans are in the middle. They are not the most susceptible, but they do get the disease. Some are refractory, but the lambs and the kids and so on, they're very, very susceptible. So in an outbreak, that's where you'll get a lot of mortality, and that has an impact on livestock production and livelihood of people that depend on their livestock. So it's a very economically important disease, but also a public health issue because of the human impact. And this kind of keep on bringing something for the students. Such graphs give you also an idea of what kind of animal model you can think of when you're doing study on such a disease, which animal are more susceptible than others. And we saw this slide, this graph from Dr. Dupree. The disease has a huge socioeconomic impact that goes from at macro level, impacting on aspects like trade and so on, and all the way to the impact on at a farm level in terms of life also and in terms of animals. But it can affect the trade. I mean, there are certain parts of Africa where they cannot trade because of the endemic nature of the disease in those areas. So it's really important element that one have to always consider. And if we look at a number of outbreaks that have occurred over a number of years, you'll see that some of them have caused really large number of mortality. And unfortunately, in many countries, the number of cases are not always reported accurately. You see, for example, the 2006-2007 outbreak between Kenya and Tanzania. There were a lot of mortality, even human, some that were reported, but some were not. And in South Africa also, we've had a serious impact with the last outbreak. We really been fearing that there would be another one this year, which it's still possible with all the rains that we've had. So we still, there's a risk. And we also in a period of 10 years now from the last one. So something may happen, unfortunately. In terms of figures, you see this slide, I took it from a presentation of there's a project that has been going on in South Africa for the past, I think, 10 years. And they came up with these figures of the cost last week. And what is interesting is to see what Dr. Dupree was talking about earlier in terms of the difference between the prevention and the cost. You see, if you prevent the disease, you're talking of less than 1.6, I think it was million or billion, I don't know. But just the ratio between the response and it's quite a big difference. If you can work on preventing, you'll have a much better, it will cost much less. And then these figures on the right, I got them from the wool industry. That's what just the outbreak of 2010, 2011 cost them, which is quite big for an industry that is trying to, just for that industry, not for the whole country. And that doesn't include the loss in terms of livelihood of people that were depending on livestock. Now, if you look at the cycle of the disease, what happens from when we are in the inter-epidemic period? Over the past few years, a number of ecologists and environmental agency and climatologists have been able to predict at least 3 months in advance when there is a series of events that could lead to an outbreak. So they've come up with this model where it shows clearly that in the first 3 months, pre an outbreak, you can predict by monitoring the weather and the vegetation cover. And then it will lead, sometime it will lead to an event of an outbreak or sometime not. But when it happens, then you get first the huge number of mosquito being born and infected and infecting livestock. Then you get an outbreak in livestock. And then almost 2-3 weeks later, you'll start seeing human case, sometime a month. And in many cases, the outbreaks have been peaked when they get into human. So in the meantime, a lot of livestock have been already affected. And it starts causing the impact, the economic impact, while the humans start having cases. And so this leads to a point where you can really, if you think of the other graph, there are a number of areas where one can intervene. Like I said, the NASA, the American Aeronautic Agency, they do issue a regularly maps showing the risk, which are then given to many countries. So you can start already putting in place your measures that will allow you to control the disease as the time goes by. So all those different points that I put there are the area where one can intervene to prevent that the outbreak has a serious impact. So there are 3 areas where one can intervene to control and prevent the disease. Firstly, the active surveillance in that period where there's nothing. You need to put in place mechanisms where one of them, for example, in terms of livestock, is what is called a sentinel animal. I'll show a graph on that. You put animals that you can monitor, test on a regular basis to see whether you're starting to see antibody coming up. Then you know that the virus is circulating. And the second tool is the remote sensing, which I'll talk a bit about, and then surveillance and so on. And then vaccination is unfortunately one of the most powerful tools that we have. In South Africa, in the past, we used to vaccinate yearly, but it's not done all the time. So if we think of the sentinel animal, this is what is called a risk map for South Africa. It was work done by the University of Pretoria. They came up with that risk map where, looking into data over a long period of time, they've identified area where the outbreaks always start. The darker the region is, the most likelihood area where the outbreak will start. And the Free State is one of the provinces where the disease is always starting. Usually when you have an outbreak, you'll see that it starts in those areas. So what one strategy to monitor is to have sentinel animals. So you take a group of sheep, for example, a farm that you know they're naive. They don't have the disease. You start collecting blood sample on a regular basis, and then you look for antibodies. And the IgM are usually the one that come up early in the infection. So you can monitor that on a regular basis and then analyze the data. As soon as you start seeing antibody, you know that the likelihood of a disease is there. The second strategy is what I spoke about, the remote sensing, which is climatic data, which are diffused to all countries in the world through the FAO. They'll give you information on rainfall on a regular basis. These are fairly recent when in South Africa, when there was a fear that we may have an outbreak. And so you look at rainfall, but also vegetation. Vegetation cover. As it rains a lot, you start seeing more vegetation coming up, and that's where the mosquitoes start exploding. And then you have the temperature. All these 3 elements, they can be combined, and then they'll cause a situation that will favor the outbreak. And you see a clear correlation. In this graph, you see the red lines are the vectors, the mosquitoes. You'll find that they would correspond with the occurrence of high precipitation or high grass cover and so on. And doing some study, this study that is being done with this program in the Free State and some part of the country, they clearly have demonstrated that when you get this water that get accumulated over a period and the vegetation change, the outbreaks are occurring not always far from those areas. And a bit earlier, they did also some mapping where they could clearly show where the outbreaks have been reoccurring, which correspond to the area that are of high risk that I showed earlier. So there's a way of preventing some of this disease if we gather that information, and it brings also the point that we mentioned earlier of a joint approach between different multi-sectoral approach to control the disease. Vaccination is a tool that is used. We have 3 types of vaccines that are used not only in South Africa, but in the African continent, as you can see in that map where we mapped a bit which type of vaccines are used where and so on. But it's very important to have a vaccination program. And this is a sort of an operational plan that was produced by the WHO and the OIE to look into how the disease can be managed using different aspects in terms of communication, logistics, epidemiological investigation, surveillance, and so on, and also clinical management. So you need that multi-sectoral approach, otherwise you'll never be able to control this disease. It's really practical aspects of what we heard earlier from the 2 presenters. So I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
So, can everybody hear me? I'm going to try and stay seated here as we enter into the panel discussion. Thank you very much, Dr. Dungu, for that insightful presentation on Rift Valley fever. So before we hand it over to the audience, I thought I would ask a few questions to the panel. And starting with you, Professor Makoter. One of the common themes in all the presentations was the importance of prevention. And in your presentation, you talked about the importance of research into what's out there. You said we can't spend all our money looking at what diseases exist, but you said we need to spend at least some and to do this more meaningfully. So in this regard, what would good look like for you in relation to that?
Yeah, so on that point, what I was referring to there is really looking at the reservoir species, because there's no disease in these reservoir species in nature. The pathogens are just there. The animals has found a way to live with those pathogens. Bats are a good example. But then when it spill over, it causes disease. And there was a drive before COVID, and it's still there, that there's about, one of the estimations is that there's about 1.7 million viruses that we don't know about that's out in nature. And we should know every single one of them. That's going to cost a lot of money. And we don't know which one of those are actually going to spill over. It's very difficult to make those decisions. So we can spend our money on that and know that bat living there has got those viruses, that rodent's got those viruses, but are we going to really prevent spillover in the end? Because it's really about those interfaces. But what came out very nicely in the Rift Valley fever example is sentinel surveillance at sentinel sites. Try and determine risk and identify sites where if you put your investment there in terms of early detection, you're going to get answers. And we won't always get it right. I think you showed that example on the economics. If we prevent 50%, what we're already saving, because we're probably not going to prevent all of them, but we're going to prevent a large percentage. So I think we need to start being clever about surveillance, where we want to target it, and get very good methods that we can also do in low resource settings. We can't go for all these fancy methods everywhere. It's not realistic and it's becoming too expensive. We really need more cost-effective, low-resource, effective methods that we can use in these sentinel sites that we think is high risk and animals that are high risk.
Thank you so much. My next question is to Dr. Dupree. So You did quite a great job of explaining the cost-benefit analysis and really the implications of not having a One Health approach, both in terms of human health, but I think more importantly, as you've said, even the economic development and livelihoods. Excuse me. So, but you also talked about some of the investment required, and I've intentionally not said cost, but investment, because I think it's important to recognize it as such. But maybe a more direct question is who must pay for all this, and why they're not doing so already?
Thank you, Madam Chair, for landing me that toffee. I think we need totally new thinking and lateral thinking. All of this will not be able to be paid from tax money by government. Government cannot stand in to take responsibility for all of this. Secondly, industry, in some sense, sometimes will also not stand in for it. Yes, when it is a huge pandemic like we saw now and there's a COVID vaccine, etc., then big pharma will come to the party. But when we talk about those orphan diseases, those neglected diseases, many times, unfortunately, in terms of big pharma, that is not on the radar screen. It does not fit in terms of what they invest in because it simply is just too small. Which then leaves the problem to small pharma, which might not have those big R&D pockets. And then comes to the question of, yes, who should fund this? And I think that is where a integrated community and integrated approach, teamwork approach will work, where public-private partnerships between government, big pharma, small pharma, academia, all come together, NGOs, and not a one single entity is funding this, but there's a total team approach, and the sharing of costs, but also the sharing of benefits. And I think we must really think in terms of how integrated networks could solve, because that is what One Health is about. It's about a network getting together around a table from a plethora of industries, companies, role players, stakeholders, from the government down to the animal owners and community. And I don't have the perfect answer, but I know when we get around the table, we can get to that answer. I hope that suffices.
I think for now we'll have to take it. Thank you very much. But I am inclined to agree that solutions are always bred by multiple stakeholders thinking about a problem together. So my first question to Dr. Dungu, I think, has partially been answered by Dr. Dupree. I was going to ask you, if Rift Valley fever is preventable through routine immunization, why is this not happening? I think Dr. Dupree has kind of highlighted, perhaps it's an issue of cost. But maybe a follow-on question is, throughout this entire conference, we've been talking about African solutions for African problems. And I think what you have highlighted is a fairly uniquely African challenge. We know there's been spillover in the Middle East and such, but it's most common for sub-Saharan Africa. So in your opinion as a vaccinologist, and we know that there's another panel happening right now looking at local manufacturing, is this not an area where we could come to the party as Africans to develop vaccine capabilities and also potentially improve local manufacturing, just looking at this particular disease area, which seems to be quite a high burden on the continent?
Thank you, Chair. I fully agree. I think it's a problem that we have to tackle as a continent, and because some people may not have been exposed to some of these outbreaks when they occur. They really affect poor communities, and it's heartening to see how people lose all the wealth, and they cannot trade, and then they have diseases and so on. So definitely we need an African solution to it. We have vaccine candidates that have been developed that are ready to be produced, but they're not being produced because the big company, like you say, they don't see any commercial interest to it. But if we have to cost the social impact of this disease, I think it's important that we look into it. And then I think it's an opportunity also for the African industry that we want to develop a vaccine industry. It's a good playground to start working on some of these vaccines for which the technology exists. We just need to get them out.
Absolutely. Any other panelists want to perhaps take a stab at that before we move on?
I can maybe just also highlight that it's essential that we produce vaccines on the African continent and not just do the research, and that it gets down to the point where we have the vaccines that's produced on the soil. We've got some of the greatest minds in the world working on this, but we not getting the production going. And I think it's really something we need to invest in. And I think what happens sometimes is we look at one disease, but we need to look at the broader picture, because then there is benefit for the company in it. It's not just about Rift Valley fever. We have a list of diseases that we need to look at. And it's essential that we get that part right, because it is part of the bigger picture. We will not be able to prevent everything from spilling over. And we're sitting with these endemic diseases that's really devastating for the communities where it occurs, where we need to get vaccines into the animals on a regular basis.
Maybe, Chair, also, I think capacity already exists. There are vaccine manufacturing plants locally. But, for example, a massive amount of money was spent to build a plant to produce COVID vaccines. And now we're through it. I don't think they've manufactured one vial. But there was the first steps to create capacity. And I don't think we need to sit down and think, oh, well, it's over and done with. There's capacity. So start thinking laterally as to what can happen there, what all can be produced there.
Absolutely. And so one other big challenge, I think, that requires a sort of multi-stakeholder approach and real thinking amongst us as Africans. And I think that ties nicely into the last point or question I wanted to raise, which goes back to ownership. And I think this has also been a critical theme that I've heard in all your presentations, is how do we inculcate a sense of ownership amongst all of society for One Health, but also, get it becoming commonplace to practice integrated communities, community networks, as Dr. Dupree spoke to. So I think linked to that, and I'll start with the multi-sectoral and multidisciplinary and transdisciplinary jargon that Dr. Dupree spoke to. And this is actually a question, I think, for Professor Matoko. So how do you see integration of One Health within the level of basic and higher education? Because if we're talking about the need to integrate, I imagine we should start there.
Yeah, so I'll use my university as an example in what we've done. We've really formalized transdisciplinary approaches at the university by creating an institute, because it's very difficult if we've got faculties in silos. We've got a very specific teaching program. You're training very specific. You need a specific outcome. So what we've done with our Future Africa Institute is really trying to function across faculties and create a platform where we create a place where we can do One Health teaching. And it's linked to curriculums. So we're starting to do that for the university, and we brought in the environment, because previously our One Health training was vets. training One Health in their curriculum, and we now brought in the medical students and the environment to really make it broader. So we're moving forward with that. There's also nationally quite a few initiatives. It's not just University of Pretoria. And there's some broader African university initiatives. AfroHun is one of them. Kuhisa, that's driven by ILRI, is another one that we're involved in, where they're looking at curriculum development. But the other important thing that we shouldn't forget, it won't always be just curriculum. We need to look at how we're going to train practitioners also. And how that One Health workforce should look, and not just train somebody in their disciplines, because we really need people that can function across these disciplines in the end. So we're also looking at those curriculums. From OLAP's side, we already developed how a One Health workforce should look. They're putting tools in place or revising some of the previous training tools to really be One Health and not just focused on public or animal health. So those things will be out in the public domain in the next 6 months for people to use and available to train students and practitioners.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Go ahead, Dr. Dungu.
Yeah, I think I just wanted to add one aspect which should really push us as African continent to seriously take One Health. We one of the continent that is the most burdened by infectious disease, and some of them are only found in our continent, and in general they really are one health issue. I'll give an example of one disease that was touched by Dr. Dupree is cysticercosis. You get neurocysticercosis in human, and a lot of people don't know it, but it's the main cause of epilepsy on the African continent. Most of the epilepsy cases are not witchcraft or whatever we think. It's cysticercosis, which circulate between pigs and human. And if we don't, you'll find that medical doctors are usually not aware of that. They will spend a lot of medical treatment on these epilepsy cases, not realizing that the source is cysticercosis. So if we don't start looking into those issues as a continent, that's just one example. There are many others. We have brucellosis that has been causing a lot of problem in some part of the continent, which are that are coming from milk that people consume, which is infected. And you get cases of fertility and all this kind of situation in human. So, and then medical doctors are not aware. So vice versa, we really need to focus on it, given the situation we are on the continent as highly burdened by infectious disease.
Excellent. And I think that leads to my last question is, and to all the panelists, what do you believe will be required to really inculcate, I think, individual and a whole of society ownership of One Health and keep it as a priority on the global, continental and national agenda? I think Dr. Dupree can go first. I see your mic is red.
It was red actually to also comment on the previous question, but maybe I should use that as a springboard to my answer. And I think it comes down to leadership. Everything stands and falls with leadership, and a passionate leader, and establishing a vision and very clear goals to work towards. One Health is a complex problem. This is not an easy thing we're talking about. This is a severely complex problem that we are trying to solve. And complex problems mean that there are a plethora of opinions and people and egos that will arrive around this table. There is a plethora of solutions, or probable solutions. There's a lack of data. There's a plethora of data sources from everyone that has an opinion, but this data is not centralized. So there's a lack of centralizing data and really doing the big data analysis, as we saw being done in this Rift Valley fever case study that Dr. Dungu presented to us, where you can really see all the role players coming around the table and then pooling everything and suddenly having clearer picture to that. all of this is happening within the context of a VUCA world where we sit with a lot of volatility, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of ambiguity, a lot of complexity. So I think the first thing is that you need very clear leadership on One Health, and therefore you need it, unfortunately, to be driven, to be kicked off by government, by a minister or a cluster of ministers taking responsibility and accountability for it, and then driving it down from there. From there, you need the public-private partnerships where industry and community get together with these leaders that have the skills, hopefully, that the universities will teach them as how to operate within this multidisciplinary, multi-sectoral, VUCA environment, but be leaders that can bring a lot of people around the table, instill respect between all of them for each other and for all the opportunities, analyze the data, and then know clear-cut how to get and how to get to the answers and the scientific-based answers, and then the solutions that will flow from there.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, so I couldn't agree more. I think it needs to be leadership shown by government, and then with the right partners, and we really need to see that happening. And there's a few examples in countries. South Africa specifically is also functioning in that space where we had a One Health, or we still have a One Health forum, and we're really re-looking at how we're going to rewrite our national plan and how we're going to structure this so that it's a committee that can drive One Health in the country across sectors, and not just under Department of Health or under Department of Agriculture or under Department of Environment. Going back to communities, I think relationships are extremely important. So we cannot just go into communities in crisis times. We need to build trust, we need to build relationships. It all goes back to that. Even with our relationships with government, it goes back to relationships. And there's a lot of trust that's been lost in COVID that's going to take time that we need to rebuild. And then you need to show benefit. If that person in a rural community in Limpopo see lesions on their cattle, why are they going to potentially report that it's foot and mouth? What is the benefit for that person? Is his cattle, or are we just going to go in and cull all his cattle and that's it because we're doing disease control? So we need to carefully think what is the benefit for that person in the community. And we're going to have to demonstrate that and create trust. And that's a long process, but in the long term, that's the only way this is going to go forward.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Dungo.
Well, I didn't think much of adding because I think I fully agree with what have been said. Maybe we need to go beyond national level and look at a continental level. I think we've been discussing our concern to see that at continental level, One Health is still being discussed in certain circles and not all where the issue should be handled. So, and yet we have a lot of such issues to deal with at the continental level.
Thank you so much. We have 15 minutes left, and I know you have all been quietly and patiently listening, which can be quite painful. So I'm going to give an opportunity to members of the audience to raise any questions to the panel. Go ahead, Tandega. And if you can all who have questions do what she's doing and just come forward to the microphone in front. Thank you. And maybe introduce who you are and your affiliation.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and good afternoon to our speakers. A lovely session, very much inspired. I am from the University of KwaZulu-Natal. I'm a biochemist who's transitioning into a vaccinology space. I don't know whether will the transition be successful one day, but I'm hoping so. I have a couple of questions. I think the very first one is for you, Prof. Wanda. I'm not pronouncing your surname. I don't want to butcher it. Yes. From your presentation, you mentioned that a big part of One Health rests on the surveillance rather than the response to a pandemic situation. And later on, you mentioned that you mentioned that there's a publication on its way to unpack various strategies that could be used in looking at that surveillance systems for One Health. I don't think I'm a very patient person to work for the publication. So I just wanted you to speak a little bit in terms of what strategies are upcoming. And to Dr. Dupre, you see now? Dupre, yes. I think first to you, it gives me great pleasure knowing that it's Women's Month, and the women even at community level have a role, and you've pronounced the role that they will play in One Health. So it's very, very comforting to know that. But what got my attention in your presentation is that I started wondering whether the trend that we see in KZN on rabies, is it just a provincial trend, or it's seen in other provinces as well? Or is rabies just is it a KZN issue? And if it is, then why is it so? To Dr. Dungu, the question that I have for you is, you mentioned that Rift Valley fever appears, it comes and goes in circles. And now I'm curious to know, what is the genetic diversity or variation in the virulent strains across the pandemic? Can you just give a feedback there? How do those strains compare to one another? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Thandeka. So that was that was a whole round of questions in one. So we'll take that and then we'll open it up again. I think, Wanda, you can proceed.
So I'll start with the One Health surveillance. So on OLAP's side, we're busy with a very high-level analysis that the quadripartite needs to agree on, because we're advising them. But I can maybe just explain a bit of what we see as One Health surveillance. So if we look at surveillance in the past, you have animal and human surveillance, which is based on diseases. We've got a list of notifiable animal diseases in South Africa. What do we report on? Only those. Same with the human medical conditions. So we're not really looking or reporting somewhere what's going on in reservoir species. So I, for instance, work on bats. I test bats monthly in sentinel sites. Where does that data go? It's most of the time on my computer, unless I tell Department of Agriculture what I think is important. We don't have integrated reporting systems. We don't have integrated data analysis. Then on top of that, what came out very nicely in the Rift Valley fever example is, for instance, how do we bring that environmental data in? How do we bring rainfall in the case of Rift Valley fever? With bats, there's other things that you need to look at. With rodents, there's other things that you need to look at. How do we bring all that data together? And there's some initiatives. Some of you may know about the Berlin Intelligence Hub. There's also some UK initiatives. It's popping up everywhere. But how we're trying to give guidance of what should be in these institutes going forward, and what should we consider. So we're so good with predicting risk in the insurance market and some other things, but we can't do this for disease surveillance for some reason. And the tools are there, the data is there, but we're just not bringing it into one place. So a lot of it is saying, this is what we need. How are we going to get that data to one place? Then obviously this becomes very tricky in terms of who's going to actually give that data, and is everybody going to play together and give all the data? Trade becomes an issue. We still need to have some control over data, because we can't just blindly report. We need quality control of what goes into that system. So it's really a complicated system to put up, but we at this point think we know what the aspects in a system must be. But it's really bringing even like reservoir status pathogens, which is not causing disease, into the picture. So that you have early warning systems. And I'm not talking a lot, but a very good example is COVID. That when we first saw the human sequence from human cases, what happened? Some scientist had a bat-related sequence on a computer at that point. It was never published. That was related to the human sequence. And that's how we started thinking this is maybe from animals, it's maybe from bats long ago. But that wasn't in the public domain. So we really need to look what we do with all the data that's generated specifically in research projects also, in real time.
Thank you so much. So before the other panelists answer, I do see the time, and I want to give the last person, I think, who had wanted to raise their hand an opportunity to ask, and then we'll finalize the rest of the questions, if that's okay. All right. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Chair, and thank you for, I think the breadth of your questions has also been very well. I think you took most of the questions out of my mouth, but thank you for that. So I'm Isa Suleiman, the research group leader at the CSIR for Veterinary Molecular Diagnostics and Vaccines. And I think I've been working on One Health in various forms for a long time, and I think there's some questions and comments around that. This concept is not new. One Health is, and particularly in the South African context, One Health has been around for plus 10 years. You know, it's not a new concept at all. But what is frustrating in a way, as a scientist that believes in One Health, is that we haven't got to the point of implementation. There's a lot of talk around One Health and the importance of One Health, but implementation, particularly at government level, we don't have legislation currently that defines what South Africa's One Health approach should be. And again, touching on what Dr. Dupriya said in terms of funding, you know, where are we in that regard? It does require a multidisciplinary approach and multi-stakeholder approach in terms of industry, government, and other various partners. But again, linking that in another way to Dr. Dungu's presentation, we have Rift Valley fever. We know Rift Valley fever is episodic 10-year intervals, roughly. What have we done in that from a One Health approach to solve this particular issue? And then FMD is another example. There's so many other diseases that we talk about One Health, but implementation is an issue. So how do we address that from a government point of view, funding point of view, and then practical point of view? That's my question. Thank you.
It's a big question. So I've noted them. I'm going to call on you, Dr. Dupree, to respond to the question of rabies and KZN. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the question. No, KwaZulu-Natal is not the only province with that severe kind of picture. The other one is the Eastern Cape. And probably, looking at the last reports, the Eastern Cape currently is even worse than what is happening in KwaZulu-Natal. There are definitely also in the other provinces, but much more isolated one-on-one cases, not this kind of outbreak situation. So exactly why it is in KZN and in the Eastern Cape that way, I'm not a rabies expert, so I'm not 100% sure, but there's a lot of roaming dog populations in both KwaZulu-Natal and in the Eastern Cape, maybe because dogs are being used to hunt smaller antelope, etc. But then a lot of those dogs become roaming dogs, and these packs of roaming dogs which fight amongst each other. But unfortunately, then also sometimes situations appear where humans are bitten by these dogs. And these dogs can get infected by biting each other if they are already infected once, or they are bitten by carriers like the mongoose. I'm not sure exactly which mongoose it is, but who are carriers of the virus, and they could bite these dogs probably when they try to hunt them. And so you get these continuous outbreaks because there's quite huge packs of these dogs. And so it is an uphill battle for government to get all dogs, and especially these ones, vaccinated to try and build herd immunity in a pack of dogs or in a dog population. But short answer is KwaZulu-Natal and Eastern Cape are the two hotspots for rabies in our country.
Thanks, Dr. Dupree. And I'm going to allow Dr. Dungu to respond to both the questions that were posed, giving you the most difficult job, my apologies. But the first one is linked to the virulent strains. Now, a lot of it went over my head. I'm hoping that you as a vaccinologist understood it very well. And then the last question that was posed is, how do we get from policy and from talking to implementation along some of these key areas we have actually described, the funding, the surveillance, and all the areas that we've sort of highlighted, as well as the community ownership and mobilization. So I'll allow you to speak. If any of the panelists want to expand very briefly, I'll allow that as well.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks for the questions. I think for the second one, I'll introduce, but I think Vanda has been more fighting with government and other institutions to get to get those implementation issues. So, with regard to the genetic diversity, very good question, and it's something that has intrigued both epidemiologists and virologists for many years. There's still one serotype of Rift Valley fever. We don't have many serotypes. There's only one. And what has been the reason for reoccurrence of the disease is not the difference in strain that have caused the outbreak. It's been parameters that are presented in terms of multiplication of the mosquitoes, environmental issue that increase the level of circulation of the virus. That's what causes the outbreak more than the diverse viruses. The little diversity that has been seen with Rift Valley fever is some strain that have natural deletions, like the clone 13 and so on, which naturally, oh, sorry, I hope you could hear me, which naturally were deleted and they were low virulence, but it wasn't really a diversity that was linked to different strains in terms of their virulence. And there's been a lot of in silico and in vivo study where they've looked into different strains and to see whether they'll have a different level of virulence, but they all are virulent. So it doesn't really play a role in terms of the severity of the disease. That's what I can say. In terms of implementation, maybe I'll just introduce and then Vanda will go. It's indeed a very serious concern that we still don't come up with. Like I said, there's a big program that is going on in the country now. We're funded by the US in terms of Rift Valley fever aspects of economics and socioeconomics and looking into many aspects. But my concern with that program has been that the intervention aspects are not being looked at, which in my view will guide the decision makers in terms of implementation of specific strategies. For example, just to give you an example, the sentinels, we don't have any legislation about it. So if a research group want to put sentinels somewhere, they do it by just arranging with farmers. There's no strategy really that is legislated in terms of having those tools in place. And we always get caught by surprise when we have an outbreak. Then we first start seeing people dying and then animals, and then we put measures in place. But I hope Vanda has been discussing with government on that. Thank you.
So I'll be brief on that. I see we're almost over time, but I'm quite positive about how things have been going for the past 3 years. Firstly, COVID opened up the conversation between different stakeholders. Everybody is talking to each other, and the discussions are happening. From my role at OLAP, I had to brief several government departments on One Health, which is already a positive thing. The National One Health Forum has been very dormant, but there are things going on around the scenes, and exactly these type of conversations on how it's going to be structured, aligning it with the global initiatives. How are we going to fund things so that there's actually practical things happening on the ground? So I think that's the discussions. One positive thing that I can mention, I'm not sure if DSI are in the room, is a call for a National Institute for Pandemic Preparedness and Prevention that went out to the universities. So this is a national institute really looking at this full spectrum, including how we need to change our policies, including training people on leadership, looking at the prevention, looking at the response, looking at the vaccines. And that brought almost the whole South African community together to at least discuss this and see how we can design a national institute that's going to actually be of benefit for the country and not around egos or individuals. And that's on the table. It will happen. So hopefully by the end of the year, we will have a clear idea of how that will look. Aye.
Thank you so much. At this point, because I know we're now standing between you and lunch, I want to wrap up, and I just want to thank our panelists for excellent presentations. I've really learned so much, and I'm sure we all have. I also want to thank the audience for being very patient, allowing us to go slightly over time, and for the excellent questions and engagement that were posed. I'm not going to add any more to the already excellent content that's been provided, but just to say thank you, and it's been incredibly rich. Enjoy lunch.